that was him in the wall.
Yeah, it is a great
This is
photograph.
Joseph Clay.
Joseph Prey was born in Michigan in 1896, but early on, by 1900, he and his family had moved to Redlands. You know, I mentioned tuberculosis earlier. Well, his father had tuberculosis, and the family came west to Redlands to see if he could improve his health. And that's what drove most of the people who died of tuberculosis in town. They were coming for their health. His father died around 1900. By 1910, his mother had married Dr. Charles Lombard, and they lived on the terrace. You might notice that this family plot marker is Lombard, and that's why Joseph Prey is buried here, because his mother married Dr. Lombard, and apparently Joseph and Dr. Lombard were close. Joseph Prey attended the Trinity Episcopal Church here in town, and he sang in their choir. He graduated from Redlands High School in 1914, and at one time he worked for the Redlands City Engineer's Office. Now, he enlisted with, there was a handful of Redlands men that enlisted in the 117th Engineers in July of 1917. This is before the draft started sending men from Redlands. The first draft group from Redlands went in September of 1917. And remember that large, there were several men that died from the October group that went. And he found himself in France in the war fairly early on. One of his best friends was Wilson Spoor. Now, if any of you are familiar with Spoor Drugstore, that was later Wilson Spoor's. I think his father had it. Wilson Spoor wrote a lot of letters back, like Florence Billings did. And the Redlands Daily Facts would ask for family members to bring these letters in, and they would take out excerpts from the letters. And that's how we found a lot of good information. And in there, Wilson Spoor talks about Joseph Prey, because they start out together, and eventually Wilson Spoor and several other Redlanders are driving trucks all over France. But Joseph Prey ends up in the front lines. And by April 1918, he was already in the trenches. Now, it's a little bit of a miracle that this man made it to July 29th when he was killed, because of the amount of fighting that he was in. He was only 21 when he was killed, and he was another one that was originally buried in France and was brought back. His was the last of the 7 reburials here on January 22nd, 1922. What was interesting, they held it at the Trinity Episcopal Church where he had been, and they said the music was particularly good, that he had been in the choir, and I guess they really tried to make the music good. And there were at least 20 men from his military unit that came up from Los Angeles for this reburial. And they brought the regimental colors, and they brought his mother the mirror he kept over his camp cot, which must have really been kind of a hard one for her to receive. And of the pallbearers, Wilson Spoor was one of them, which would be hard on him, of course. And then this group went from the Trinity Church. As with all of these burials, there would be a ceremony at a church or a funeral chapel, or perhaps in the Redlands Amphitheater when they had several thousand people attending. After that, a smaller group would come up to the graves. The American Legion group in town was particularly involved with that. They usually had a firing squad, and they would play taps. Now, if you try to picture what this looked like at the time he was reburied, notice that the markers around him, very few of them are from his time period. So there weren't a lot of markers here. There weren't a lot of burials yet. And it was probably fairly open. The trees were probably not terribly large. And so they had the gravesite ceremony here. There is, do we have the photo? Okay, good, of him in the trenches. Okay, at this point, we have ended the formal tour. However, we're going to unlock the mausoleum. And I want to say, since we're in the shade right now, I want to say a couple of things about the mausoleum. It opened in 1928, and as you look at it, there are Egyptian motifs on it, which is like, why are there Egyptian motifs? Tut's tomb, Tutankhamun's tomb, was unearthed in 1922, and ancient Egypt were the rage across the country, and including in Redlands when they built this particular mausoleum. Now, as you go in the front doors, just to the left, there is a bronze plaque with 35 names of people from Redlands who died in service to the country. And that was put up by the American Legion. We don't know when it was put up. It has to have been created after November of 1919. The American Legion group didn't get formed till then. There are 5 men's names missing off of it. Some of them may have died after they made the plaque. One of them, though, was Dean Nethaway, which you saw down below, who died during the war. And of the 5, 2 are University of Redlands students, and Redlands claimed University of Redlands students as theirs too. So there you'll see 35 names, including Mabel Wellman's name. So at this point, I'm going to let the group just wander toward the mausoleum if you'd like to go in and look at the plaque. It's probably the only plaque that I know of that survived the war as a memorial. The City Hall had all the names, over 800 names listed. That City Hall burned down, and that list did not go further. And the other efforts they tried in town did not come to fruition. So the plaque that's in a locked mausoleum is sort of our only one. Whether it'll ever get moved, who knows. So go ahead and go in. There's lovely stained glass windows to look at, and see how many names you can spot off of that plaque now that we've talked about today.
An anecdote for those of you who are attending our World War I film series, one of the films that didn't make the cut is The Fighting 69th with Jimmy Cagney from 1940. The battle that's depicted in the end of that movie, the Battle of the Ork River, is where Joseph Prey was killed.
I had to say, okay. Oh,